the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest, we want to mention we've got a Patreon account, www.patreon.com/MUHH. Consider dropping us $1 a month there, or if not, leave us an awesome review on iTunes. Either way, we appreciate you. Today, Taylor and I will be having Jon Repetti join us to discuss Deleuze's Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation. Very hearty welcome to the show for Jon. We'll usually like to start out with guests with a kind of simple question. If there's kind of like a singular moment or experience or thinker or something that sort of, I guess, got the intensive process of a philosophy and theory, traversing your body like some sort of tsunami, you could tell us about that.
With that preface, it's going to be going to sound like a weird story than it is. I got into philosophy because I wanted to be a writer, and I have wanted to be a writer since before I could read, since before I could spell. When I was a kid, like 2.5 years old, before I knew any words, I would get these ruled notebooks and just scribble between the lines and pretend I was right. It's almost like a graphomania type thing. And I sort of just always assumed at some point that would happen for me, that this would be where my life would go. And so I went to college and went in as a writing major. And, I took one workshop and my stories were terrible. Everybody else's stories were somehow even worse. And it was really discouraging because you would just be sitting there and like not able to make language do what you want it to do. And that winter, like dead of winter, it was 4 feet of snow outside the dorm. I read Anna Karenina in like a week. And that was like both totally life affirming and totally shattering, because it was like, oh God, Tolstoy's done it. Why should I bother? And so I decided, okay, like if I ever do want to write, which might happen one day, I need to read and I need to know things and I need to get there. And so I transferred into just English, and I went to an English department that was really philosophy heavy, that was really into literature as intellectual history of the novel or the poem as a kind of demonstration of philosophical problems or social problems, and where I was pushed really to read more philosophy, to think about writers with philosophy, like, Emily Dickinson and Kant, Melville and Hegel, like those sort of like those classic kind of undergrad pairings. And I loved the other side of it so much that I got stuck there, and eventually I went to grad school and I met, do you guys know Russ Leo?
I don't think so.
He just got tenure at Princeton. He's a fan of the show. I mentioned you guys.
Oh shit. Okay.
Yeah, I love that show. But he's a scholar of Spinoza and a historian of anti-psychiatry.
Oh wow.
He's writing a book right now about Guattari, about Laborde, and about like the history of anti-psychiatry in France and America.
You'll have to liaison us.
Dude, he would love to.
You said his name's Russ Leo?
Dude. Russ Leo. L-E-O.
Okay, awesome. Go on though. Sorry.
Yeah, but so I kind of fell under I took the Spinoza course with him and really fell under his wing. And we read the first half of the course is you read the ethics, like by book, sentence by sentence, axiom by axiom. And the second half was all about like Spinoza in the 21st century. So
awesome.
There, Negri, Federici, all this. And I just and that's the obvious kind of, from there, Deleuze and Guattari. And from there, basically everything, like all of, all my psychoanalysis, anything I'm obsessed with now is where I am.
Yeah,
of that class.
Spinoza as not just the 20th century, but we talk about post-Kantians, but you could say like the post-Spinozist There's also like a post-Cartesian bent, obviously through Spinoza as well, but there's a whole map of thinkers from Spinoza. But in the 20th century, it's particularly, I mean, there's still works that are, I mean, I've talked to you about Matheron's book that's like 800 pages, what is
Yeah.
the individual and community in Spinoza or some shit. And then there's, one of Deleuze's teachers, there's the rules, unfinished books on the ethics. I mean, I assume what Deleuze's interest in Spinoza, is that how you latched on then to becoming interested in his work?
Yeah, like I realized that everything I loved in Spinoza gets expression in Deleuze, like sort of my Spinoza. I realized that my Spinoza is in so many ways Deleuze's Spinoza for however many reasons, which is interesting because usually it's the other way around. Usually get into Deleuze first and then Spinoza. But I felt like a kinship there, and a sort of like a kinship of energy, like a kinship of writing, like the way that he wrote, the way that he kind of tried to turn criticism into a form of flight
Yeah.
and into a kind of like movement across a territory as opposed to a burrowing into, let's get to the philosophical heart of this. Let's get to the meaningful kernel inside, like the way that
Right.
Deleuze, in this book especially, kind of just passes over the surfaces of the paintings and coordinates them and coagulates them.
That's a good point. It's interesting because Deleuze's two books on Spinoza are they're kind of strange in terms of like practical philosophy as one of the quote unquote monographs. It's written in an interesting style, right? Because it's broken up by a kind of glossary and doesn't feel as particularly coordinated, almost more for like, again, kind of like Badou's ethics for undergraduates or for a more lay audience.
It's almost like notes towards a book,
Right.
or
And
it's
then
almost like an appendix to a book that he
right.
never wrote. Yeah.
And then obviously the expressionism book, The Problem of Expression, being a secondary dissertation, it's much more hardcore than the monographs. So it stands alone, it's beefier. But then you have all the seminars on Spinoza that are just fantastic. And speaking of the translator of this work, Dan Smith's involved with Charles Stovall at Purdue and getting all of that stuff collected for us. So that makes sense, that trajectory. And I guess we wanted to start with maybe outlining a few things before getting into the book. I mean, I mentioned offhand that sometimes there are aspects of Deleuze's work that get less attention. A Thousand Plateaus maybe sucks up so much attention from this era, right? 1980 versus what this is published in 81.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, it can be easy to get stuck on some of the early monographs, Difference, Repetition, Logic of Sense, Anti-Oedipus, A Thousand Plateaus. Some of the later work can get less attention. And so this one kind of falls in between the later monographs and obviously What is Philosophy. And it's also interesting because it's kind of like the Proust book, right? It's a book on an artist rather than on a philosopher, which is more typical of the monographs. Although I guess the Soccer Masok book is potentially another figure we could throw in, which we talked about yesterday. My version of the book, which I got, maybe just was not scanned correctly, but I didn't get to read Dan Smith, the translator, his like little preface. But you had some interesting anecdotal stuff about Deleuze meeting with Bacon. I thought we could start with that and then maybe talk about where this work kind of fits in and then get into the work proper. So we'll just ease in just for, I guess, obviously for my own education since I missed this part, but also I think it's good to situate this work for the audience again who may or may not be more or less familiar with this work on Bacon.
This book comes out in 1981. It's published in 2 volumes. One is the maybe 140 pages of the text, and the other is the pretty high quality images of the Bacon painting and the paintings that Deleuze names to try to explicate Bacon. So Cezanne, El Greco, et cetera, et cetera. He seems to have written it like very quickly, immediately after, or just as he was really wrapping up the work on A Thousand Plateaus. There's questions about whether or not he might have actually owned some of Bacon's paintings. Yeah, Tom Conley in the afterward suggests that maybe, we don't know for sure, but he could have at the time had some of them in his study and been working with them over the course of writing ATP, actually. But he seems to have met Bacon one time that we know of, that the biographer knows of, and it was not a great encounter. Like, shows up at Bacon's studio, or Bacon shows up at his apartment, and Deleuze is surrounded by a chorus of like admirers of his students, of his like hangers on. And this is the period where he's really attracting a lot of them. It's when he's in slightly better health than he is later. It's when he's kind of risen as the intellectual of 68. And Bacon is kind of turned off by this. He thinks it's all like really French and really kind of, like, I mean, but Bacon is like the bon vivant of English artists, and Bacon doesn't love it. And he likes to be the center of attention too. And so there's kind of a power struggle between these two men almost that leads to a somewhat cold friendship. But we know that Bacon read the book, that Bacon liked the book, that he was flattered by it, and that he at least didn't reject Deleuze's points. You'd think a lot about like the quote from that late interview about buggery. I read these books and I give these philosophers bastard children. What's somewhat unique about the Bacon book is that it seems that Bacon would have recognized this child, in fact, does recognize this child, which might be partially an effect of Deleuze writing about a living artist, a living figure, which I think is interesting. Like the way that he positions vis-a-vis his subject or his object in this feels to me somewhat unique. But yeah.
I mean, that's interesting just to get the stamp of approval from the thinker you're writing about. That would be something that's something unique to add. It's interesting, right, that you mentioned the second volume that has all the prints, because I tried to look for this and I couldn't find it, because it would have helped, I think, in reading the book. The French edition does it differently. I think I told you this, the way that the French text outlines it, instead of internal brackets numbered like in the English, it's on the outside, kind of like the conclusion to 1,000 Plateaus, when they're citing internally, so to speak, they're referring back to earlier plateaus. It's almost like the same type of formatting. I don't remember who published. Was it Monwy that published Mille Plateau? Because it was Sewell that did the Logic of Sensation. So it could be different publishers, but I think it's obvious that Deleuze liked this formatting of having the numbers on the outside of the text as a means of reference.
It's a very like medieval apparatus. Like I'm pretty sure that like medieval texts, with the like index, like which is the finger pointing to the page number, like which is very much of Deleuze at this period too. I wouldn't be surprised if it's some kind of
You see this in like I mean I have a number of different Bible versions, but you see this in like King James New International Version, where it'll be kind of pointing to another, as you said, indexing another passage in the Bible internally, right? So it's got its own kind of codification system. So yeah, it's just interesting to think that having that secondary volume easy to, because it's ordered in this way where you're reading the text and it's like 2763 and you're like, what the fuck? So you have to look at the end of the text to see how they're numbered. Sometimes Deleuze will name them, and so you can like Google them, but you can do it. You can pull up all the paintings if you really take your time, but you're going to double or triple the amount of time spent with the text. So having just an easy reference to look at the numbers would have been something absolutely fantastic. But obviously, for rights reasons, for the price of publication, we can imagine various factors going in, not including all of those paintings, which they number what to like 100 and more than 100.
When he was writing the book, Deleuze, he really only had access to the prints themselves. Like he had seen some of Bacon's paintings at exhibitions, but he had a book of the prints. He had a book of interviews with Bacon from the mid-70s called The Brutality of Fact. And that's where a lot of his quotations of Bacon come from. And he had like 2 books that have been written about Bacon that are just very much in the background, that I think he only cites like 1 or 2 times each.
Right. He mentions them offhand. Yeah.
And he seems to really have just gone for it. Like he really just dove in, wrote these chapters like in a sitting or in an afternoon. And they have that feeling of him kind of running over the terrain, crisscrossing it, looking back from the hill.
Right.
You know, they have that sort of.
Well, it's kind of like the method of 1,000 plateaus, where any
Yeah.
plateau is kind of, it's written from the middle, right? So any sort of line or any sort of theoretical point could feel at home in another plateau, where it's something similar, even if the chapters are arranged somewhat logically. As you said, there is a kind of, interspersal of the lines that they could fit in other chapters. There's a crisscrossing. I think that was the word you used, which I like. And it reminds me a little bit of one thing, and I'm not trying to delve yet. I guess we can start delving into the content, so to speak, proper of the work. There's this play that Deleuze makes between hysteresis, which is a concept that is completely separate from hysteria, but Deleuze collapses the two words. And I was looking through the etymology. Hysteresis is from the Greek hysteros, which means later, versus hysteria, which is from the Greek hystera or hustera, if you want to pronounce it, whatever, for womb. But Deleuze collapses the two because he'll go into, and we can talk about the hysteria of painting. That's something that's very interesting. We can get to that. But I just wanted to point out that this is, Deleuze makes it about, because hysteresis, the way I always think about it is there's a kind of a lag or a delay of an output value in relation to an input. So you think of a thermostat, if it's trying to keep, the temperature at 72, if the temperature drops, it'll turn the heat on. If it goes above 72, it'll turn the heat off. So there's this delay and lag, and Deleuze rightly relates it to the après coup, the Nachtraglichkeit, right? That Freud always talks about, the after fact, this sort of interplay between a before and an after, which we sort of talked about beforehand, about the like the blank page. Already being virtually, and see, this is interesting. This is where the painter and the writer,
like the egg almost too.
Right.
Hysteria chapter. I thought that was good. And I'm glad you brought up Nachtraglichkeit, because that's exactly what I was thinking too.
Another important biographical thing is that often in Bacon's life, his triptychs were separated.
You mean as in they were displayed not as
displayed as a triptych,
okay,
but then sold to 3 different people.
Oh man, okay.
Isn't that wild? And still, some of them are owned by different people, and so museums have to make deals with each of the various
geez,
to like display them together. The Lucian Freud triptych was separate.
Right. Like, and there's 2 of those, right? There's 2 Lucian Freud triptychs, right?
I believe so, yeah. But at least one of them, I think the famous one that sold for like 150 million 10 years ago.
Oh yeah, I saw that. That was, it broke. It's
incredible. Yeah, but like was sold to different, and Bacon was bothered by this, but he had a deal with his art distributor.
He was bothered by breaking up the triptychs?
By breaking them up, yeah.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, because originally he started doing them seemingly as a practical measure. Like he did these series, basically because he had a deal with his distributor to do a certain number of paintings per year for what was effectively a salary.
Right.
They would sell them to other people. And so he would hang out for 10 months of the year and then do all of his painting in a rush in the last 2 months so he could get his money for the next year.
Right.
So it started out as often as a kind of a serial pragmatic decision. And then later on, it became totally integral to the work. I mean, there's also like the very early major masterpiece from 44, like 3 figures at the foot of the crucifixion, which was a triptych in the beginning. It was meant to be a triptych and was never supposed to be separated.
That was one of the first pieces that like got him renown.
Yeah.
Right?
The one that's like the wailing goose, like it's like 3 sort of weird bird-like figures.
Yeah.
That one, but for the most part, it was, they were separated. But we're talking about now Nachtraglichkeit, like this is totally, they're so much less interesting individually. They need to be together. You look at the Lucian Freud paintings, and what's so mysteriously effective about them is the adjacency and the way that he balances them together in ways that are not narrative and not even spatial necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, despite what Deleuze says about the fact that each individual painting itself has this aspect of the triptych, right? Where it's this unity and multiplicity shit. I think you're right. There's, at least for the uninitiated like myself, I do think that having the triptych, there's something there, despite what Deleuze claims to the contrary, that each individual thing has this triplicity. I don't know if I necessarily buy it, but I, at least conceptually, in this philosophical way of moving from, let's say, the unitary figure with its vibration, the duplicity, the duad with its resonance, and then the triptych then having a kind of forced movement, blah blah blah, and that of course you can find the multiplicity in the one. But I don't know, I think that you're right. There's some sort of violation of artistic authority, if you will. But death of the author, whatever the fuck, that's interesting about the triptychs. I didn't know that. And I know Lucian Freud was like an artist, contemporary artist with him, and it was one of his friends, and they may have had a falling out due to an argument. But it did seem like a lot of the triptychs are of acquaintances and friends.
I think starting in the 60s and 70s, he starts painting more and more of his friends, of his lover, George Dyer, who is a sort of a Genet type figure. Bacon meets when he's in his late 20s, and he's a criminal, like a street kid, really.
He's a bad boy.
Which is what Bacon really was. Bacon is
But he was like a gambler and shit, right? Before he became a painter.
He was a gambler, an interior decorator.
He was a vagabond.
Yeah, but he was also he is related to the other Francis Bacon.
I assumed.
That's
great.
Which you can only imagine how much Deleuze loved that, right? Like the father of empiricism and the great empirical painter.
Right.
But
even though Deleuze never really talks about the OG Bacon.
It's completely absent. Yeah.
Right.
And maybe I don't know what that is, but like Bacon has a tough relationship with his own father. There's a story from Bacon himself, who's a known liar, that he was kicked out of the estate, out of the house, because his father saw him wearing his mother's underwear. I mean, and who knows, like he also claims to have, come on to his father and been attracted to his father. Like he has a whole sort of mythology of perversion around himself. But we do know that he basically lived in London, Paris, Dublin, various cities, like on £3 a week.
Oh wow. Yeah.
And met older men who supported him, was and that's how he lived until his father died. When his father died, he came into the inheritance. Then he found his own kept man, being George Dyer, and they stayed together for years. Dyer was a bottle a day alcoholic, and like not a bottle of wine,
Yeah.
And
it takes a lot of skill.
And Dyer dies in a hotel while Bacon is in one of Bacon's like real coming out success shows in the 70s. And he comes back from the show and comes back from the dinner and stuff, and his lover's dead. And that kind of leads him to retreat from society, from these other people, and to do more of these sort of hermetic paintings of his friends. It's wild.
The mythologizing that he did about himself, that one of his friends would be the grandson of Sigmund Freud, right? So there is this interesting little and this is why I brought up the Hysteria, which is in the middle of the book. It's chapter 7, where we get a beautiful description of the body without organs, which we obviously will want to go to. I know that's one of Coop's favorite concepts. And he redeploys those famous lines from Artaud, which he does in Logic of Sense in 69, to where we first see Deleuze playing with this notion. even if he doesn't explore it as deeply as he does here, we get some interesting conceptual apparatuses to play with. But in any case, I just was thinking about this notion of hysteria in the paintings, and it actually, despite the collapse of hysteresis and hysteria, which I find interesting, I do think that the basic understanding of hysteria, again from Freud, Charcot, the 19th century, even if obviously the notion of hysteria has a much longer history, thousands of years, but this notion of what Freud talks about in terms of conversion as being the main, or one of the main, along with amnesias and other things, but conversion being one of the main elements of hysteria, right? That the psychopathic symptoms display visibly in the body. That helped me to understand what Deleuze was trying to do with arguing that there is, whether or not we talk about it in terms of force movement, which is, I know, localized in the triptych, but the spasming of the body, the invisible forces that affect the body in Bacon's work, bringing out what he calls the spasm or the scream or the what is it, the plexus, right? So like, we can visibly see the body under duress, and that is one of the elements of what Deleuze is calling hysteria in painting, these invisible forces that are affecting bodies, which, you know, is linked to sensation, linked to the direct nervous impact, and it's not cerebral. It doesn't go through the faculty of the understanding or whatnot, right? I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff out here just to, we can dive in wherever we feel like.
Yeah, I think one key thing about the hysteria chapter is that it's also a kind of a repost to Lacan.
Oh, interesting.
Because like when Lacan says, like for Lacan, the symptom speaks, this, or the symptom is the body speaking or signifying.
Right.
And for Deleuze, the symptom is almost like an inversion of that, or a copula. It's speech bodying.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah.
Like it's something, it's
because it's not located in a signifier.
Exactly.
For Deleuze.
It's like it's the body sort of like erupting in something that is not speech, or like escaping the code. It's, if that makes sense, not the code coming out of, not the code using the body as a sort of
a medium
communication system. Yeah.
And no, that's, I like that. I like that.
To him. Yeah.
I might read this little section just to fill you in, John, a little bit background. So what was it, 2 weeks ago that you were here visiting Taylor? Something like that. So we went to a Sun O concert.
Oh yeah, I was visiting.
When Taylor was visiting,
he was visiting me. Yeah, he was visiting me in Austin. We went to a Sun O concert. I provided Taylor with headphones. I'm like, this is a show that you absolutely must wear headphones, or not headphones, earplugs rather.
Yeah,
just to protect your hearing. And I think there's an interesting, like, at the time, I felt like there was some kind of signifying aspect to the music and the way that it. So there's that, which I think goes to a little bit of what he discusses with Bacon and sort of the, I guess, like the canvas is the body without organs to some, or like an egg or something like that to some extent. Form takes precedence over representation or something like that. I'm being very
deformation.
Yeah, I'm being very quick and dirty with my
go ahead
description here. But for one thing, just like anecdotally, it was funny because Taylor said he didn't wear his earplugs, and I'm like looking over, and he's nodding off, and I've got my earplugs in, and I'm like worrying that I'm gonna lose my hearing even with earplugs in. I had a hoodie on, and I threw it over my head as well, just because I felt like the assault was so intense. But I think that there's something shared in this notion, or the way that Deleuze talks about music. Maybe I'll just read this and then we can kind of recapitulate. But in the end, why should all this be particular to painting? Can we speak of a hysterical essence of painting under the rubric of a purely aesthetic clinic, independent of any psychiatry and psychoanalysis? Why could not music also extricate pure presences, but through an ear that has become the polyvalent organ for sonorous bodies? And why not poetry or theater when it is those of Artaud or Beckett? This problem concerning the essence of each art and possibly their clinical essence is less difficult than it seems to be. Certainly, music traverses our bodies in profound ways, putting an ear in the stomach and the lungs and so on. It knows all about waves and nervousness, but it involves our body and bodies in general in another element. It strips bodies of their inertia, of the materiality, and of their presence. It disembodies bodies. We can thus speak with exactitude of a sonorous body and even of a bodily combat in music, for example, in a motif. But as Proust said, it is an immaterial and disembodied combat in which there subsists not one scrap of inert matter refractory to the mind. In a sense, music begins where painting ends, and this is what is meant when one speaks of the superiority of music. It is lodged on lines of flight that pass through bodies, but which find their consistency elsewhere, whereas painting is lodged farther up where the body escapes from itself.
God, that's so good. Yeah.
Right.
No, I was thinking when you said sono, I knew exactly where you were going because like that pulse, right? Like the pulse of the bass and the varying layers of pulse that you feel in your body when it happens, like an ear in the stomach is exactly what sono sounds like to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the rib cage too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like
Yeah.
it does turn to go to a motif that
Hmm.
Deleuze brings up. It turns the bones into flesh, right?
Yeah.
Because you feel your diaphragm, your skeletal structure vibrating. It puts an ear throughout. It sort of the structure of the bones melts back into the field of the body, so to speak.
Right. And not just that, but that like the resonances themselves have sub resonances. When you're down in those really low registers that they play in, there's the tempo of the song itself. There's this sort of like, there's the throb of different frequencies kind of finding each other and separating, getting closer and separating. Do you know what I'm talking about? I don't know the musical theory term for this, but it's this sort of like, but those frequencies, those varying frequencies that come together and separate, those are motifs, I think, in a classic sense. Right. In the sense that Deleuze is using, because it's order emerging out of the chaos itself. The noise itself is producing its own resonances that are not intended by the guitarist or by, in the same way that like
Right. Yeah.
Pollock will paint and there will be concentrations of color in certain parts of the canvas that he did not intend to, but that end up there, and that he then has to do the work of deciding, okay, are we going to keep this concentration of yellow in the upper left, or are we going to try to balance it out with the bottom right, etc.
It's beyond and beneath all melody, all harmony. It's a sub-representative domain
Yeah.
of vibrations and resonances, force movements, whatever. They don't coalesce in a kind of melody or
Yeah, it has nothing to do with melody. That's what's and that's what's embodied about it, right? Like it has, that it's all about, it's in time, and it's in the sort of slow vibration of time. Yeah.
Ooh, that's good.
It's the Dune shit, Coop. It's the move without rhythm.
There
is the walk without rhythm. There is no like, the rhythm is completely spontaneous, or if you will, it doesn't resemble any natural rhythm.
It's like pure difference or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
being too
continuous. No, it's continuous variation. So yeah, I guess that's the thing where it is interesting, right? That the next chapter begins with, after Deleuze demarcates music and painting, he then like collapses and says there's like a common combat to all art, right? Which, how does he say it? Oh shit! Now since I brought it up.
While you're looking for that, I'll just talk a little bit about how I felt it was kind of cool that the way that I think the Sono experience really displaces and turns the body becomes the ear. Mm-hmm. And the ear is actually like you have to disintensify like what you would sort of presumably like the function of the ear is to take in sound. But here it's almost like you have to mitigate the intensive experience that is, I guess, right, this kind of transcendental idea of what the ear's function is supposed to be. And it displaces that throughout the body. Deleuze even talks about in this chapter the way that I guess sense maybe is the word that he uses that kind of describes the way that the it kind of flows over as this sort of wave form over the body. So just the connections that I made.
It hits the nervous system and not the brain,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
like it's this immediate like encounter with, as opposed to like the Cartesian picture of sight, where like the light hits the eye and then there's
Right.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
projection in the back of the brain. What you get in a Bacon painting, for example, is a kind of immediate experience, the textures and the traits, and you can't really get this in the reproductions, but like you see a Bacon painting in person, it's so heavy and textured and rough that you can almost feel it tactilely before you know what you're looking at. Like he's short-circuiting your sensory apparatus in a way.
There's definitely an asignifying component, I think, to tie the Hysteria chapter to maybe the first chapter, in the way that the face is deterritorialized in Bacon's paintings too, to where it's kind of the same sort of relationship with the music, right? Because the body becomes the ear itself sort of dissolves or like constructs this whatever body, or I don't know how to really tie that
Yeah.
together perhaps, but the way that he displaces the face into the head, so to speak, I think maybe there's some type of connection there.
Yeah, because the face is a part of the system for signifying.
The organization of the organs or something like that.
Well, it's the organization of the signifying surface. And out
Very
of
good.
which,
Very good.
it's the why this is A Thousand Plateaus stuff, which he's kind of playing with when he talks about
Yeah.
faciality in these early
Absolutely.
chapters, but it's, the white wall of the face is the wall off which the signifier bounces, and the black hole is the swirling source from which consciousness arises to fill out a signifying aspect. And
And how
so
that relates to the blank canvas, the sort of potential of the blank canvas as this kind of body without organs or something.
well, it's already, well, I think that it's interesting that it's already for Deleuze, and this is where the painter and the writer have affinity, right? The blank page on the screen, or the blank page in one's hand versus the blank canvas. Deleuze is saying it's already swarming virtually with these cliches, that we're already in the page,
yeah.
we're already in the canvas, and we have to get out of it. That's
Yeah.
the artist's goal, is to get out, just
Out of representation specifically.
right,
Is what he says in the first chapter.
which is why the face has to be deformed and the head turns into a scream, right, out of which the body is trying to like exit itself from one of its organs. And I think that this goes back to what I was trying to say about the common problem of all art, that Deleuze immediately collapses the distinction between the arts by saying that it's not about representing, as we've been saying. It's not about narrating, illustrating, figuring. It's about capturing forces. And so I think that all of this kind of goes back to this question of capturing forces, kind of like, when Proust talks about a little bit of time in the pure state, it's like a little bit of force in the pure state without, as John was saying, going through the brain, which I know you brought up Descartes, but I always was thinking about the way that Deleuze complicates Kant, or sees in Kant's third critique the complication of the harmonious accord of the faculties, where the brain would be delegating to one of its faculties the means of harmonizing, reason, understanding, whatnot. And so that's the cerebral apparatus, which would impose a certain organization, kind of like when Deleuze says the body with organs is not against the organs, it's against the organizational form. It's against the organism as determining the organs in a certain specific function, just like the kind of Kantian cerebral apparatus would be coordinating through the faculties and already imposing those forms, those categories, if you will, in order to disempower chaos, the little bit of chaos that we're trying to sieve in different ways.
The essence of the ear to hear, but like the Sunno example, like that flips it on its head, where the body becomes the ear and sort of breaks up that Kantian kind of description you just gave.
A little ear in each organ. Yeah.
Oh,
go ahead,
right. Ooh,
Joe.
nice.
Yeah,
1,000 ears.
The organs are ontologically secondary. Like the individual senses are ontologically secondary to this sort of primordial rhythm, or to the body without organs. But experientially, they are primary, and they have to be sort of pushed aside or reorganized in a way that allows us to get at a little glimpse of what is primary. I'm trying to avoid surface and depth metaphors because those are a problem in Deleuze, but this seems to be where he's getting at with Bacon, is that Bacon is trying to capture a glimpse of the body in a moment of force, of sort of like when the head is deformed, it's almost as if you're seeing like, like if you watch like a film like Raging Bull and there are those slow motion shots of Robert De Niro getting punched in the face and you see
Right.
the ripple of the blow moving across his body, like those are the
Right.
sort
Yeah. Yeah.
he's trying to do something similar to that in painting that is not figurative, that's not dependent upon.
To stick with this non-figurative, non-representative, I mean, there's, what is it Deleuze talks about, and this, I think he's quoting directly from Bacon, where Bacon is saying he's trying to capture the forces of the scream and not depict the horror that perhaps causes the scream. So there is not this causality where we see the horror and then the scream is an effect of that. It is, we see the scream as embodied and forced by these invisible forces that are sort of, again, non-figured, they're non-representative. It's a bit of, what was the quote from, I think it was from Paul Klee, where it's like, not to render the visible but to render visible, right? So there is this, it's not about figuring the horror, if you will. It keeps it invisible and therefore a little bit more I mean, it's interesting because for Deleuze, it's not about the abomination or the horror itself in Bacon, despite appearances, right? It's, there is something more. The horror is not depicted. It's left in abeyance.
And there's a kind of fascination. I'm thinking, just as we're talking, looking for more sort of workaday examples that might illuminate what Bacon is trying to produce on the canvas. I'm thinking of this memory when I was a kid. I must have been like 7 or 8, and I was in the car with my father, and we got stuck in a rubbernecking traffic jam, where the car had been pulled over to the side and people were just stopping and looking to see, what it. And I asked my dad, like, well, why are people stopping? And he said, they want to see what can happen. They want to see what can happen to a body. My father never went to college, but he was totally Spinozist in that moment too. They want to see what a body can do and what can be done to a body, like the kind of horror of, you think about like cartoons of characters that are contorted and exploded and get your head through the steering wheel, or, like it's those sorts of contortions of the body that Bacon is almost placing a gambit on and saying, like, you like this, don't you? And he's trying to kind of draw it, and that's the draw of these paintings, isn't it? Like, it's like, how contorted can these figures become before they become unrecognizable as figures, as what was once Lucian Freud, if that makes sense, or who was once George Dyer.
Be interesting
I
to
mean,
almost like bring in a little bit of like Ballard's Crash in this same vein, perhaps. Go
Yeah,
ahead,
no,
Taylor.
I'm sure Ballard loves this stuff. I have no, yeah.
well, I was kind of thinking about how Deleuze makes a formula for it, where it's that there's always going to be some sort of figuration, but it is sort of turned against itself through these different strategies, whether it be scrubbing, the blurring, the asignifying traits and marks and brushes, as John said, that go into the texture of the painting that you can see when you're in front of it. You're sort of forcing back into the primary figuration these aspects without resemblance, right? This is, how does he says, Bacon, he quotes Bacon saying, create resemblance but through accidental and non-resembling means. I thought that was a kind of interesting way of, because it's the same with a writer. I mean, just to try to, I already made the analogy between the blank page and the blank canvas, which is already for Deleuze virtually swarming with these cliches, and the struggle against cliche becomes a cliche, blah blah blah. But I think the interesting thing is we are always sort of stratified, right? There's always, just to use A Thousand Plateaus language, there's always going to be a bit of figuration subsisting. There's always going to be a bit of signification subsisting. And you can get caught up in merely struggling against that thereby reproducing new formations of imprisonment. Or, as kind of Deleuze in these first chapters, he's really kind of making clear that Bacon has a method that does come with playing off the field and the pedestal and the imprisonment, the encasement, and sort of forcing them to interact in ways that are localized. Because, and this is where Deleuze goes into Bacon's preferences for, or that there's ways of struggling against representation that could lead us into abstract art. But I think for Bacon, that becomes kind of a mess, I think is the literal word that Bacon uses. It encapsulates the whole in a way that loses the diagrammatic effect, which would be this play of chance in randomness and the non-resembling means and whatnot. So I do think that it's interesting thinking when we look at a number of Bacon's paintings, there are these, let's call them, like, I don't want to call them tricks, but there are these tactics, right, of situating. You started to go into it with this, where's the field of color going to sort of build the contour versus the deformation that's happening in this space.
There's strategies. Yeah, like they are no less than, say, the development of Renaissance perspective. They are strategies for rendering something. Except what you're trying to render is not a representation of the world. What you're trying to render is a sensation. Like these are. So I'm trying to reconstruct the chapter about this. So I believe it's chapter 14 or 17, where he talks about after representation, there are a few paths forward. There's Mondrian's path, which is the path of the eye, the EYE purely, which is radical abstraction, absolute abstraction, squares and colors on a canvas. There's Pollock's path, which is the path of the hand purely, which is wherein the referent of the painting, if there is any, is simply the artist's act of throwing the paint onto the canvas. And he says that Pollock's painting is a kind of, it's purely handed in a way that it can't. This is one thing I wasn't not able to figure out. I was like, what does he find? Like, why doesn't he like Pollock? It's too deterritorialized, maybe. I mean, there might be a little bit of biographical stuff going on, just that, Pollock died because he was an alcoholic and he was in a car crash. Like that.
Right. Don't de-stratify too quickly, right?
Exactly, right. And I mean, like there's a certain heroism to Pollock in Deleuze, and I think to the French more broadly, they sort of see him as a kind of a hero of America who is struck down.
Interesting, yeah.
But Bacon, for Deleuze, finds this path. In a way, it's like, this just occurred to me now, but it's between France and America, right? Where's the middle ground? It's Iceland, but really it's England, right? He's in the middle of the French idealism and the American handedness, which is also a point that he brings up in the that Deleuze brings up in the American literature essay, that there's the French novel of psychology and the American novel of the frontier, and they're sort of these radically opposed aesthetics, and England's right in the middle. And Bacon, for him, he maintains, and he spends years sort of stumbling around figuring this out. He maintains a bare minimum of figuration that allows the diagram, the chance elements, to achieve a certain kind of discreteness and force within the painting that allows them to appear as deforming, as opposed to in Pollock, where there's a certain, if you ever look at like, have you guys seen a Pollock in person, the big Pollocks? There's this almost like geometrical balance to them. They feel like they are these sort of swirls of chaos, but they're at the same time, your eye is led to everywhere equally. They're perfectly rhizomatic, and in a way where the differences don't make a difference anymore. Whereas in Bacon, the differences always do make a difference. Each of these sort of asignifying marks are very distinctly and effectively placed. Like, I don't mean like as a assessment, like, oh, he did a good. I mean, like they have effects. Each one has its own effect and transmits you from one level to another.
Right.
The painting.
That's true. The levels in sensation that I think Deleuze takes straight from Bacon's interviews, where the abstract painting, whether it be Pollock or whatnot, doesn't transfer us from these different levels. And then so that in that way, actually is more like a photograph, ironically,
Mhm.
than like what Deleuze sees in Bacon. And I do think that it's interesting, just because you mentioned the chaos that, so to speak, appears throughout the an abstract painting like a Pollock, where, for Deleuze and Guattari and What is Philosophy, they say it's not that chaos doesn't have determinations, is that they immediately disappear when they appear, right? So
Mhm.
I think that's the interesting thing, where you said the differences don't make a difference. I think that's just
Mhm.
another way of rephrasing what you said, where there are infinite determinations, and therefore at a certain point you could say no determinations, but they disappear as they appear, without leaving us with a way to sieve out these differences. That's a part of it too. I mean, that I think that again shows that's one of the ways of struggling against the representative, figurative, the common problem, right? It captures forces but releases them at the moment of capture. So I think that's perhaps where there is a tendency to offset Bacon from these other movements in art.
Yeah, it seizes them but releases them at the moment of capture. That's exactly, and it's that moment of release, or rather, because even that would constitute a narrative moment, but it's that moment where you can't tell if are they being seized or released at this time? Like, is the figure, like the seated figures, like, is Lucian Freud crossing his legs or uncrossing them?
Yeah.
And like those are questions immediately prompted by the triptych form that doesn't offer any answers. Like the work, you look at a Pollock, you don't have questions. I mean, I love Pollock. Like, there's something that almost like Rothko too. There's something almost sort of like quieting or silencing about the work in its finality, in its sort of self-completeness. Whereas Bacon prompts a question to then deliver you into a realm of undecidability. He prompts a question and then cancels it. And you're
Right.
sort of thrown into that oscillating point, as opposed to the sort of almost like monistic calm of the expressionists. Not de Kooning, but at least Rothko and Pollock. I have a question for you guys. How would you describe Bacon's relation, or Deleuze's relation to Bacon within this book? Because me and Taylor talked about this yesterday, but for me, Deleuze does this thing often where he'll start over the course of the book to get close to almost sock puppet his subject. He'll sort of speak. By the end of the Nietzsche book, he really is writing like Nietzsche, and it's a sort of a stylistic and it's a persona taking. Whereas in this book, there is a respectful distance. I sense like he never pretends to speak for Bacon or as Bacon, or to demonstrate Bacon to you. And that to me is, it speaks to how Deleuze is trying to work out after A Thousand Plateaus the relationship between philosophy and art, and what the proper relationship of the philosopher and the artist is in
Right.
any given encounter. And I'm trying to articulate that to myself.
What's the relationship between the affect and the concept? Right.
Good
Nice. There
question.
it is.
I do think that's why Deleuze will not parrot. He's not going to start writing like Proust,
Mhm.
right? He's going to evoke. He's going to dramatize, for the one hand, Proust's struggle against the philosophers of yore, right?
Mhm.
Because it's the fact that, philosophy is an enemy for Proust only because it doesn't have the clause of necessity, as he says, right? So this is where the realm of art takes on a certain precedence, even if, for Deleuze and Guattari, he wants to referee and say philosophy, art, science, they all think, despite what certain thinkers may have said. And the artist is a thinker, right? I think that, but the artist isn't necessarily mobilizing concepts, nor is that necessarily their role, even if they can expound upon their art or other art and develop concepts, which then they would be philosophizing. But when they are producing art, that
Mhm.
is not their main goal. That is not their purview. So I do think that on that level, there is no way in which to puppet Proust, to puppet Bacon, right? There is a way in which Deleuze is going to be, and that's the respectful distance that you're talking about, is that
Mhm.
Deleuze is going on to terrain that Bacon has hinted at in the interviews, which is why Deleuze will say, like, you can tell when Bacon talks about chance, he's not really being understood by, it may be Sylvester that did the interviews with him. He may be referring to that volume, which
Yeah, he is,
Brutality
yeah.
of Fact, I haven't read it, but
Yeah, he is referring to it. Yeah.
I saw Deleuze's comments on them, and Deleuze is like, it's kind of like the discussions between Artaud and Riviere. There is this gulf that can't be bridged, where they're not even like maybe speaking the same language. Because Bacon is trying. What's that?
What's the Deleuze quote where he says, like, when I hear someone say discussion, I reach for my gun.
Right. Yeah.
To discuss is terrorism.
Yeah. So I think that for Deleuze, when Bacon is discussing, and it becomes in Deleuze chance choice, right? Because it is a kind of a chance that is seized upon and therefore not random. It's not probabilistic. And it's also not necessarily, even if there is a know-how in the craft of Bacon, there's not necessarily a route directly to the goal, that there is not a conception of the finished product in mind as the process is going on, which would then liken him somewhat to Pollock, right? One could say that it's the randomness that is itself chosen. But I do think that at a certain point, there is a difference there where the randomness isn't conceded to the whole, right? There is, create resemblance, but through non-resembling means, as Bacon says, right? So there is a sense in which chaos is not the primary goal, or the movement of the artist's strokes and non-strokes and different techniques isn't the main movement in the paintings. But in any case, Deleuze is not necessarily trying to, articulate affect through affect, because then he would be making art, right? He's trying to articulate the conceptual aspects of the affects and percepts that are being mobilized by Bacon. And so that's why they remain on fundamentally different terrain, and why it isn't necessarily, as you kind of mentioned before we started recording, that it's not essentially the same type of immaculate conception, the same type of buggery that's going on. There isn't necessarily, one could say, maybe not even a buggery in any strict sense in which we can see that he attempts with Hume, and what he said, he tried to take Nietzsche from behind and Nietzsche took him from behind, which I think is what you're getting at with the end of Nietzschean philosophy, where Deleuze may be writing in this Nietzschean style and maybe being the one being taken from behind, or he tried to take Spinoza from behind and Spinoza politely resisted or some shit, right? So we can see that, Deleuze's Bacon isn't necessarily already a Bacon in the sense in which Bacon was not a philosopher, not in any concrete sense. So if there is a buggery, it is much more on a domain that would deal with a virtual Bacon. Because all he has is some of those interviews and a little bit of the writings, but it's, again, Bacon isn't necessarily performing the role of philosopher there, right? So a philosopher has to be constructed out of what we have, in not just in terms of the visual domain, but some of the disparate writings. And it's that philosopher that is fashioned out of this movement that Deleuze is trying to create, that then one could say there is no original, quote unquote, right? The copy model is totally broken. Because I do think that's one of the interesting things about the buggery thing, which Deleuze is famous for, is that it assumes there is a kind of model that one is copying, but then breaking with, and then simulacra reign.
Like
but
the cliches you talked about in the
right, like the cliches. So but there isn't a pre-existing Bacon philosopher that would be modeled to then break with and make simulacra reign. So the simulacra have to be constructed out of nowhere, or it seems like this is why he's talking about these other paths that art could take to break the figuration. There are these other models, but then somehow Bacon stands in as the reign of simulacra or whatnot. So I think that's where the fundamental difference would lie for me.
And these are strategies that Bacon's developing to solve problems that are particular to painting, but nonetheless have analogies across domains. That nonetheless, like Deleuze will say, that painting has been ahead of philosophy for the past 100 years. Like they've had been 30 years up on us. Every development we have is foreseen by them. even though he stands by the sort of radical separation of the domains, almost as if they're like Spinozist attributes, right? That they sort of like they fall completely separately. They are absolutely discrete, but nonetheless they braid together like a kind of double helix.
Right.
And there are these moments where they just touch, where a little bit of affect creeps into philosophy and a little bit of philosophy creeps into affect.
I think that's an interesting point. I guess I was thinking about in the Abecedare, Deleuze is talking about, he makes an analogy between the painters and philosophers, where I know he talks about more than just Van Gogh, but Van Gogh is one of the main
Right.
and he talks about him in this book too, but Van Gogh is one of the main ones where he talks about Van Gogh's not timidity, but hesitance to use color, and that Van Gogh you really had to prepare and practice and perfect your craft before venturing into color. You don't just jump in and start throwing colors around like a kid with a new crayon box. In the same way that the philosopher doesn't necessarily just jump in and create concepts willy-nilly, right? It is related to a problem. It is related to a selection process it's not just creating concepts for the fun of it. And I think in the same way, as we can see with Bacon and perhaps any artist development, there is a way, like for example Cezanne, right, that he's always coming back to, and he even quotes D.H. Lawrence on Cezanne, and this struggle with the appliness of the apple, and creating something more alive and intense than Plato's ideas, blah blah blah. I think there's something similar with what Deleuze is making an analogy between the craft of painting and the craft, if you will, if we can use that analogy, of philosophy. And so in each one, and not to get Heideggerian, but if each one is creative, which I think Deleuze agrees with, if philosophy is creation of concepts, science is creation of functions, and art is creation of percepts and affects, there is a sense in which each involves a craft, a kind of poesis that has to be practiced, learned, attempted, and it has to take some sort of domain that forces us to think, that forces a problem on us. Otherwise, it's mere masturbation.
These domains have to meet. They have to sort of circle each other like dogs in a ring, right? They have to meet carefully. There's a Bacon quote. I'm not sure if it's in here, but I think I know it's in the interviews where he says, like, painting is not war. War is war. I come back to that whenever I get a little too self-serious. Painting is not violence. Violence is violence, and that there's a defense of an ethical defense, as much as we can say that Bacon has an ethics, like, of that distinction, or rather like a demand that we approach it gingerly or with thought, like the way that Deleuze slowly wades into the world of Bacon's system and of his affects. Like, to begin with, first there is the figure. You can almost see, like, over the course of the chapters, him looking. You can imagine him, I'm going to read this book every day. I'm going to look through all these prints every day, and every day I'm going to think of I'm going to write a new chapter. Like, it's this kind of return and retreat and return and retreat, that as a model of, like, not just of thinking, but of criticism, of, like, as a model of aesthetic labor, it's incredibly appealing to me. It's incredibly, it's a guidebook for Bacon. It's a series of commentaries on Bacon, and it's a model for how to make such an encounter yourself, which I think Deleuze would, endorse. If anything, maybe that's why he's not sock puppeting Bacon, because if anything, he's not trying to get too close. He's worried about what'll happen. Can you imagine like one of these Bacon portraits of Deleuze? I think that would be like, sitting in the apartment or something, or on the dais. We never got it.
They should have become friends, and then Deleuze could have been one of his subjects, right? He missed that opportunity.
Is it too banal to just discuss he does bring up the development of photography as placing painting or painters in a new sort of a new problematics, right? How does one paint whenever the sort of primary function, right? The function of painting, almost like the organ, becomes displaced in its sort of transcendental mode. Because once we can faithfully, we'll say that in quotes perhaps, recreate the subject of our, through portraiture or whatever, to the photograph, what are the sort of effects of that problematic on painting as a form of art that demands new techniques, that demands new, I don't know, some
It's
new
almost like
conceptual apparatus to be applied? Why does painting persist as a mode of art after the photograph? What is that about per se?
Deleuze brings this up to dismiss it, right? That the photograph would have supplanted painting's representative role, which would have reigned in the time of the great religious sentiments.
Right.
But
Yeah.
Deleuze brings that up to immediately like dismiss it, right? That painting has never necessarily been about the figurative, right?
yeah, and that there were
It's about
aspects of the figural in El Greco, in
right.
Roman art, etc. Yeah.
Right, aspects of the figural as opposed to the figurative. So I do think that it's a false problem for Deleuze that he brings up in order to sort of help to reestablish this notion that photography for him is not necessarily an art, or at least if it is an art, even its role is not to figure, to narrate, to illustrate, at least if we consider it an art. I think that this is one of Deleuze's ambiguities and why he's also a bit ambiguous about cinema at times, where he has to work through Bergson to dismiss some of Bergson's own ways
Yeah.
of thinking of the movement
Yeah.
image, etc. But
Yeah.
Right.
you're right. What are the two? It wasn't just El Greco though. It was Giotto's stigmatization of
Yeah. Of
Saint.
Saint Francis, yeah, Giotto's with Christ as an airplane over
Yeah,
the.
he's like a kite, right? With
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
the stigmata are the lines tethering
yeah.
Jesus in the sky to and then there was another one. I don't know if it was Tintoretto, but it was the creation of the animals, right? Where
Yeah.
or
Where
Deleuze
God is
says,
shooting the starting gun.
right,
Yeah.
God is, yeah, it is interesting, this question of atheism. What does Deleuze say? I mean, this is something that he's not the only thinker to have done this, but it's not that with the absence of God everything is permitted. It's the other way around, right? There's somehow, and he doesn't really go into this too much, but it's somehow with, if art is now an atheist game, right, so to speak, with the death of God, or whatever you call it, it is as though there isn't this freeing domain where one could have taken on the codifications of dogma and doctrine and then done whatever one wanted to, as long as as long as you tick the boxes of having religious imagery, then you can do whatever you want. As almost like with the atheist game now being the domain of art, it's as though there are more rules rather than less. Deleuze doesn't really go into this too much, but I do think that he's trying to go with something of what Coop was talking about, where figuration has to be, as we've been saying, dealt with very delicately. Even if a modicum of it subsists, what is the role of, say, something that Deleuze doesn't really talk about, but what is the role of, say, something like photorealism in art? Again, is it to try to depict better than a photographic lens the quote unquote reality of being in the world, or is there something perhaps in the hyper realism of the resemblance, something surreal, non-real, non-resembling? Where is that? That's not really a question that Deleuze brings up, but it is a question that I have, like, because Coop brought it up, I think, very nicely. Like, if painting is not to compete with the photograph, which I think is a false problem for Deleuze, what about a type of painting like photorealism?
I think Deleuze would say that the photograph sort of sets painting free,
Mm-hmm.
confronts it with the vertigo of its own freedom, in the sense that painting, no, like photography has taken over the role of representing a figuration.
Yeah.
It has taken over more or less the role of representing the world as we experience it, representing the visual. Painting now has to look back to itself and figure out what it will do. This is the problem that Bacon is still trying to.
This is the problem.
One of Bacon's problems, right, is how and what painting will do. I mean, painting with like a capital P almost, in the sort of impersonal sense of the progression or the development of painting as a discourse, or as a, I guess, a discourse. But what it will do is it will return to its essence, but through the back door. There's a line in chapter 14 where modern painting begins when man no longer experiences himself as an essence, but as an accident. It's this painting will rediscover its fundamental delinkage from the real, its non-representational aspect, which it originally had in the Egyptians. This is why Bacon proclaims the superiority of Egyptian art, because it is the painting of pure essences, right? Which is just, that's fucking awesome. That's so cool. But like, but then he'll go on to say, today we have painting that returns to essences, but it's the essence as an accident, as a hexaity in the Deleuzean, as a singularity.
I mean, Deleuze does this in Difference of Repetition, right? Where it's the inessentiality of, say, the differential calculus, as shown in the infinitesimal, for example, that thereby creates the essences, rather than starting with the molar essences and then worrying about which every little bit of hair and mud and whatever has its idea, like in the Platonic forms. It's the inessentialities that constitute the essences. So as you said, hexaity, pre-individual singularity.
Vis-a-vis the photorealism thing, I think that Deleuze would actually say that photorealism is the other side of Pollock. It's that because what is being depicted in photorealism, the referent of it is the artist's hand in the exact same way, except instead of standing back and witnessing the textures and stuff, you're standing close and looking for the brushstrokes. And it's a kind of, it's a sad passion almost. Like it's a sort of a sad attempt at aspiring to, rather than taking up the mantle of abandoning representation and going off on your line of flight into the figural, it's a retreat and aspiring to the condition of photography, which I think Deleuze would have nothing but contempt for.
Probably.
That's just me.
I think it's probable that you're right.
Yeah.
It's trying to outdo technology at its own game, which then becomes a question of mastery, technical skill taken to the point where it substitutes itself for the regime of art and its creation of affects and percepts. I don't know if that completely dismisses it as a means, but it seems to, I think, for Deleuze, and again, this is a problem where we start to delimit what is art from non-art. And this is why I don't necessarily agree with Zebke or with Deleuze, where he seems to dismiss photography as an art form. He seems to like leave that question ambivalently. And I do think that there are means of art and photography, but I do agree with Deleuze that they wouldn't necessarily be about representing. There would be something where they would have to rise above that. And so, yeah, that's the paradox of hyperrealism. And I guess that we would need to bring in Baudrillard to maybe do some sort of play on the hyperreal of the photorealistic genre of painting, being, telling us something about our cybernetic selves and blah blah blah. Right? I mean, I don't fucking know.
What's the difference? Here's a question. What's the difference to you between like a photorealist painter and a method actor? They seem to be partaking in the same ideal in a way. Say like a method realist performance,
right?
Where when you're watching something like Raging Bull, I don't know why I came back to that, but like it's one of those performances where the actor dissolves into the role, but at the same time, De Niro is so good in that film that he like ruins it, because all you can do is stare at De Niro and watch how good he is at acting, to the point that it becomes an exercise in appreciation rather than an experience of affects.
But as you said, the cinema isn't reduced just to one actor or just to one role.
No. Yeah. No, I'm talking about like in a very isolated way, that like
Sure.
demonstration of skill that dissolves the being and appearance distinction, or is attempting to.
I do think it's interesting to think about, especially towards the end of the film, where there is almost a Baconian aspect of the deformation of his face, where it is the kind of lump of flesh. But I don't have an answer for you about method acting and photorealism. I think there's something interesting in that analogy.
I mean, there's a certain representational aspect that I think is the kernel of what you're trying to get
Mhm.
at, but I really couldn't articulate beyond that. I would just throw up, where do we think something like pointillism would fall into this? Because I feel like it kind of sounds like, from what you guys are saying, would almost describe Pollock's work as like this deterritorialized form of a pointillism, like taking pointillism beyond itself into something further. But I don't know, because
I think
then
it,
you get into
yeah.
the interplay between distance and the actual technique itself. And
Doesn't it take the hyper, again, it's not photorealism, but if part of the Renaissance, despite what Deleuze may say or think, if part of it was still representative and not yet getting to the sub-representative elements, there's a sense in which the brushstroke had to be eliminated. The actual activity of the artist is eliminated behind representing a scene or figuring a scene or narrating a scene. Whereas pointillism takes that to the extreme, where now the brushstroke is dissolved and deterritorialized into the multiplicity
ooh,
of
that's good.
points, to where
Mm.
the brush is no longer an apparatus or has been defeated. It's one way of defeating this move of hiding the stroke. The stroke is gone away with the technical means itself. And so I think that is a performance of technical mastery and prowess, since we can, there is a way in which obviously there's still a representative element to it, but there is the sub-representative that kind of calls beneath. This is why
Yeah.
that scene in like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right, where you kind of get you keep getting zoomed in, you can zoom into the molecular and get threatened with the consistency of one's reality, right? It can become psychotic. I mean, this is part of the way that the psychosis is described, right? Is being kind of, for example, like the pores in the skin as being like a field of little vaginas or something, right? There's a swarming of differences beneath the sort of molar surface that can threaten the consistency of reality. That's obviously not like a Lacanian way of talking about it, because that's about foreclosure and whatnot. But in Anti-Oedipus, they describe psychosis in this way. You losing the face, for example, is one aspect of psychosis. No longer representing the face, you dismantle the white wall black hole system. The signifier is destratified in a way that I think for them is different from the type of creative semiosis they see in schizophrenia. It's not unrelated. It's just that there is a way in which one can then dismantle the face, but be subsumed by a semiotic black hole. That's where you get
Interesting.
the catatonic,
Yeah.
the psychotic.
In a way, then, is this book a kind of, maybe the closest pair it would have then would be to the Masak book?
I think so.
Perversion and hysteria as lines of flight from schizophrenia, or as sort of way stations on the way to it, or as strategic positions to take up to avoid, absolute deterritorialization
Right.
that gets problematized so radically in.
A line of flight from neurosis at the very least.
Yeah, like that, like hysteria, at least in the sense that he's developing here, and perversion are not the Oedipal neuroses, and that they are in some ways like heroic positions to occupy
Yeah.
without falling into the black hole.
And also, I mean, I do think that it's this, because he brings up this question of a clinical aesthetic, we get this question of the clinical, which obviously, as you mentioned earlier, that's how Deleuze kind of ends his career with essays, clinical and critical. But there's this question of what is the role on this non-analytic role of a clinic? What is the clinical aspect of art? And I think this too goes back to his allegiance to Nietzsche, this question of a diagnosis of culture, this question of a way of breaking with the sort of doctor patient type of binary, wherein wherein the artist himself is not just a diagnoser of culture, but a part of that culture, and therefore also a patient, where there is that distinction breaks down, and yet it is about vitality, if we want. It is about intensifying life in a way that avoids absolute deterritorialization or catatonia or whatnot. This way of intensifying life for the sake of life, and not re-stratifying ourselves to accord with a status quo or normal neurosis, whatnot, which we may sometimes see in Freud's worst moments, right, where we're trying to adapt people to a type of patriarchy, a type of civilization wherein their symptoms would at least be mollified so they can function. But I think that that's where the analytic machine and the artistic machine and the revolutionary machine, as Deleuze and Guattari talk about it all throughout their joint work, even in What is Philosophy, right, when they talk about the people to come, and that if art can kind of capture the infinite in the finite, blah blah blah, they don't necessarily summon the people, which is a part of the revolutionary machine, but they can summon conditions for making possible the reality of revolution that they see. So I think that that's the clinical aspect of the Masok book, the Bacon book, and getting it all to sort of run together. I mean, this is why I think Deleuze and Guattari are a little bit modest and maybe polemical when they say, is it our fault if artists and writers understand schizophrenia better than the analysts? But I think that that's just an ancillary thing to the fact that the art machine is essential to moving the motors of the revolutionary machine. And I think for Guattari, the analytic machine, if it loses the revolutionary aspect, you're back into a kind of standardization that capitalism would, that you're just trying to smooth the wheels of capital, right? If you lose the artistic machine, then you actually lose the vectors that can dislodge people from their most overwhelming, whether it be catatonia or just a kind of dead repetition. This is where Guattari sees Swann in Proust's novel, right? Failing at becoming artist. The failure of art and the failure of love dooms him to a kind of repetition that gets overcome by the narrator by chance of an asignifying refrain.
It just occurred to me that 81, this is the same year as Lacan's seminar on Joyce, on the same
that's
seminar
right.
23, which is all about art as the last defense against total schizophrenia. It's the kind of radical loss of world, right? Like Joyce embraces his Santome, which is what compels him to write and to continue to find these sort of endless ambiguities and puns. Would that we all had such a useful Santome, but
I mean that's Coop posting on Twitter, right? So
yeah, exactly. Because as you were talking about, the clinic, like I was thinking of Laborde and the famous story of Deleuze going to Laborde and being like, this is weird. I don't like it here. You guys scare me. Felix, please keep your weird patients away from me. There's something about like looking for
typical philosopher, right?
Yeah, really. And I mean, like, I don't think I would have a good time at Laborde either.
Hey, I'm not. Yeah, like, let's not judge too quickly.
What I think is interesting is that he loves the idea of Laborde, and he loves the sort of like the little, I mean, in the same way that Negri talks about little islands of communism everywhere, RIP to the real one. You get this sense that he's looking for, when I hear the clinic in Deleuze, I can't not think of Laborde and of Guattari and of the Guattarian clinic as a kind of anti-psychiatry, as this producing these little islands of something with room to maneuver, I guess would be the way to call it, where like people have just a little bit more room to maneuver.
Islands of transversality, maybe, is what Guattari would say, right? The islands of capturing a little bit of that de-hierarchization, a little bit of that anarchy that keeps people more mobile and more free, and not stuck in a rut of doing the same fucking thing, right? I think that's part of the grid. And
the lines,
differentiate, and the lines of flight,
the wander lines. I
do think that part of Deleuze might say, and this is just, again, go back to Nietzsche and the way that Nietzsche talks about constitutional types. And he talks about his own constitutional type. He doesn't like to travel much, right? He kind of likes to stay in the same place, do the same things. He has a routine. Part of his health is a factor in that. I mean, I think that Deleuze did not have the constitutional type of health, no offense to him, to do what Guattari did at Laborde. It took a different, and it's a part of personality, but I do think it's a part of good health to be able to throw yourself into that type of situation every day without losing one's resilience and commitment and resolution. There's a quick way to dismiss Deleuze as ableist and just say, like, he doesn't like crazy people. And that might be partly true. I do think it does also come down to this question of one's constitution. Again, Nietzsche's thinking about his ideal society where people are assigned roles and positions and jobs, so to speak, that produce the least amount of suffering. And it depends on the constitutional type. And this is not to say that he's still thinking about organizing this hypothetical utopia around the exploitation of labor or whatnot, right? But that there would be, types who flourish in manual labor, whereas obviously there's artists, there's scientists, there's thinkers who may not flourish in that same milieu given the same circumstances. It all depends obviously on the forces under which one is individuated, but I think that's part of the Nietzsche's utopian ideal, which he doesn't really write about much, but it's like an offhand passage, maybe from earlier works like Human All Too Human, something like this, where he almost sounds a little sentimental, where he's thinking about his own constitutional type and where he probably, after suffering the horse injury in the Franco-Prussian War, I think that's what it was, right? He's not really able to, his body is not really functioning in such a way that he could perform much manual labor. Even he has to even quit teaching by the time he's in his 30s, right? Because of his health. So he's thinking very consciously about this wound he was born for, to quote Bosque. I don't know. So
each his abilities and so forth.
Hunt in the morning, farm in the afternoon, write criticism at night. No, I mean, like, I think that if there is a communism in Deleuze that can be reconstructed, I think it really does boil down to that, like to each his flourishing.
Yeah, I like that.
To each his symptom. And the heroes in Deleuze are the ones who commit fully to what I guess you could call their symptom, like the sort of the heroes of thought for him and of aesthetics, like Proust in his cork-lined room, Bacon with his suffering and his endless reiterations, Massac in his journals and his, like, there's these
Bartleby's refusal.
Exactly. Like there are these figures of like sort of obstinate commitment to your symptom, or what Lacan would call your symptom, or what Deleuze would call like your line of flight, or what your symptom is revealed to be a line of flight. I was just thinking, this will be my last comment, I think, about hysteria and hysteresis. So it's literally like if you combine those two, it's later and birth, right? Or later and womb.
Yeah.
So like in a sense, like what the pun has something to do with the afterbirth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The womb that and the afterbirth is Lacan's figure of the libido. It's this sort of like the organ that we lose at our birth that is separated from us. The sort of lost wholeness is figured for him in the egg of the afterbirth. And like finding your little ways back into that feels like the point of contact. That there's something that, everywhere that is home to me is something like a womb, even though not in a resemblance type way, like by non-resemblance. There's
and that goes back to flourishing. That goes back to the egg undergoing forces that would be impossible for an individuated being, undergoing torsions and tensions and deformations, like in Bacon's paintings, that would crush and rend an individuated being. So there is this sense in which, obviously Deleuze talks about it in terms of body without organs, but there is a sense in which, there is Bacon is playing with the forces of individuation in a way that might be impossible for normal bodies to undergo. And I think that's part of the horror of the flesh, right? The suffering of the flesh that is supposedly depicted forced movement that somehow rends the flesh and yet leaves it intact. It's part of the movement of the artist exiting the canvas, the body vomiting itself out through one of its organs. Jon, we could give you a chance to hype up sort of what you're working on at the moment. Could be finishing a dissertation. It could be potential. You said you've always had this desire to become an aspiring writer. You could be writing something creative at the moment. Anything you'd like to plug, or any other kind of shout out you'd like to make, we'll give you the last word.
Thanks, guys. No, I've got nothing to plug. I have to finish a dissertation in the next 6 months. So
Okay.
I've been up in the morning, type. It's going to get done. But after that's done, we'll see where I end up, if I get a VAP or if I find a real person job, who knows. But my partner and I, my fiance now, and I, we just got engaged.
Yeah.
Are,
Congrats.
thanks. Yeah, no, we are working hand in hand, more or less, on a kind of dystopian crime novel that, with any luck, will be done in 7 years. So keep an eye out.
All right, that sounds great. Yeah, I'll have to get with you maybe this coming week, maybe next weekend, just to see if you've got any comments for my translation that I got to turn in here soon.
The Simondon?
Yeah, the Simondon. I gotta do that. I gotta turn that in. Hopefully I'm going to turn that in before the end of the year. So maybe we could just spend an hour or two going over anything that you see, any comments you got for me, because you were very helpful with the Chernyavsky, which I appreciate. Yeah. I know that since you're finishing the dissertation, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do.
No, it's not that. Like I think I left about 150 pages of comments in a Google Doc. And okay. I've got a bunch of others that are sitting in a different document in my home computers. I downloaded it because Google Doc. So I will get you the more comments. Yes.
Awesome. I want to thank you for being willing to participate. It seemed like when you tweeted about this book, there was a lot of interest. And I think that just kind of goes to show you never know what's interesting, but it's one of those books that Coop's wanted to do for a good long time now. And so I'm really happy with what we did today, and the off ramps that we took to discuss some of these things. It gave a lot of food for thought. Obviously we didn't exhaust all of the work, but I think we did a good job kind of maybe hyping up some of these topics. And again, just thanks for your time, and we'll be talking soon. This episode probably will release next week?
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
So
awesome. Thanks, guys. This is super fun. Totally honored. Love you guys. I genuinely listen to this show like religiously. So it's a huge, massively appreciated to be on. So
well, we appreciate you, Jon. I had a lot of fun. Love you too, buddy. And we're gonna let you go. We're gonna stay on just to plan for next episode, because I know we got Christmas coming up and other things. So we will let you sign off, my friend.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Thanks again to Jon Repetti for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. See y'all next week.
The very rules of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.